The solicitor read the will aloud on a Tuesday morning in a study that smelled of old leather and older spite. There were 4 people in the room: the solicitor, Mr. Cartwright, who had drawn wills for 40 years and had never included the word "nothing" in any of them until this one; the cousin, a man called Dudley Fenton, who had arrived from Norwich that morning in a hired coach and a borrowed coat; the housekeeper, Mrs. Kemp, who had served the Waverly family for 31 years and whose hands had not stopped shaking since she entered the room; and the daughter. She sat in the chair nearest the door. She had chosen that chair on purpose. She always chose the chair nearest the door. 13 years in this house had taught her that the fastest way to survive a room was to know how to leave it. Mr. Cartwright reached the final clause. He paused. He looked up, not at the daughter, but at the space slightly above her head, the way people look when they are about to say something they would prefer not to be responsible for. "And to my eldest daughter, Katherine Waverly, I leave nothing, no income, no provision, no claim upon any property, holding, or asset of the Waverly estate. It is my express wish that she receive nothing, and that this wish be understood not as an oversight, but as a deliberate and considered judgment upon her character." The room went silent. Dudley exhaled. Mrs. Kemp pressed her fist against her mouth. Katherine did not move. She had read the will 3 weeks ago. She had found it in her father's desk while balancing the accounts he did not know she balanced, in the estate ledger he did not know she kept, using the arithmetic he had told her she was incapable of learning. She knew what the will said. She had known for 21 days. And in those 21 days she had not cried, not once. Not because she was strong. She was tired of people assuming that about her. She didn't cry because crying was for people who were surprised, and Katherine had stopped being surprised by her father a very long time ago. She had hoped once, when she was younger. She had stopped hoping around 16. The not crying was not strength. It was the scar that formed over the place where the hoping had been. What she did not know, what no one in that room knew, was that the will had a second copy, filed with a solicitor in London. And that solicitor worked for a man who, upon reading the document, had set down his coffee, cancelled 3 appointments, and said to his clerk, in a voice so quiet it barely carried across the desk, "Get me a horse." To understand who that man was and why he got on a horse, I need to take you back, to a house in Wiltshire, to a woman, and to the 13 years that the will erased in a single sentence. Waverly Hall sat in a shallow valley in Wiltshire, 3 miles from the market town of Devizes and a century behind it. The house had been built by a man with ambitions and inherited by a man without them. A handsome Georgian block of pale stone, symmetrical windows, a portico with columns that had once been white and were now the color of surrender. The grounds told the story more honestly than the house ever could. The formal gardens had contracted to a kitchen plot and a stretch of overgrown lawn that the single remaining gardener, Thomas, 63, stubborn as bedrock, maintained with the grim determination of a soldier defending ground long after the battle has moved on. The stable held 2 horses where it had once held 8. The east wing had been closed for 6 years because the cost of repairing the roof exceeded Sir Edmund Waverley's willingness to spend money on anything that did not directly serve his comfort. Now, this story takes place in 1845, and I need you to understand what that means, because it matters. This is not the Regency. The era of Almacs and Assembly Room vouchers and elegant society marriages is 20 years gone. Victoria has been on the throne for 8 years. The railways are tearing up the countryside. The Corn Laws are splitting Parliament down the middle. Factories are dragging families from villages into cities by the thousands. England is changing. fast, loud, violently, in every direction except one. The law regarding women and property has not moved a single inch. The legal term for what a woman lost when she married was coverture. The word literally meant covering, as though a woman's legal identity were a candle to be snuffed the moment she said, "I do." Under coverture, a wife's property, her income, her legal right to sign a contract or appear in court were absorbed into her husband's. She did not lose her rights gradually. She lost them at the altar in a single stroke, and she did not get them back unless he died first. An unmarried woman had slightly more standing. She could own property, could sign documents, but without money or male protection, those rights were theoretical. Paper freedoms for women who could not afford the paper. And in 1845, the world was making all of this worse. Across the Irish Sea, the potato crop was failing. The famine that would kill 1 million people and displace 1 million more had already begun, though England was slow to admit it. In Parliament, men were screaming about the Corn Laws, the tariffs on imported grain that kept bread expensive and landowners rich. Every estate in England was watching the price of grain and wondering what came next. The agricultural world Katherine lived in was not stable. It was shifting under her feet. Remember that. You will need it. The west wing of Waverly Hall was warm. Sir Edmund's study was always warm. His bedroom was always warm. The dining room, where he ate alone since his wife died and his daughter was no longer invited to join him, was heated to a temperature that would have been comfortable in July and was merely adequate for a Wiltshire January. The room where Katherine slept, a narrow chamber on the second floor, originally the governess's room, with a single window that faced north and caught no sun at any hour, was not heated at all. She had a blanket, she had a candle, one per week, rationed because candles cost money, and Katherine, in her father's estimation, did not warrant the expense of visibility. And she had, hidden beneath a loose floorboard under her narrow bed, a leather-bound ledger that contained 13 years of her life's work, and that no one in the world knew existed except the estate steward, Mr. Hale, who was 60 years old and who had been waiting, quietly and with diminishing patience, for someone to acknowledge what Katherine did. But I am getting ahead of myself. To understand what happened in that study on a Tuesday morning, to understand the will and the word nothing and the man on the horse, you need to understand Katherine, not the Katherine that Sir Edmund described to the world, the real one, the one who existed in the margins of his lie. Katherine Eloise Waverly was born in September of 1816, and from the very beginning she was the wrong kind of daughter. Not wrong in any way that mattered. She was healthy, alert, curious, and possessed of the kind of focused, methodical intelligence that would have delighted any parent who valued such things. By 6, she was reading her mother's novels. By 8, she had worked out the principles of double-entry bookkeeping by watching the estate steward through the study keyhole. By 10, she was asking questions about crop yields and tenant rents that Sir Edmund could not answer, delivered in a clear, unhurried voice that carried the particular sting of a child who does not yet understand that knowing more than your father is, in certain households, a dangerous thing. She was not a beauty. She knew this early in the way that girls know it, not from mirrors, but from the way people looked past her toward her. Mother, who had been fair and delicate, and everything that the word pretty was supposed to mean in 1826. Katherine took after her father's side. Brown hair that resisted every attempt at curl, and which she had long since given up on, pulling it back in a plain knot that she secured with 2 pins and forgot about. A square jaw. Hands that were too large for a woman's, broad across the palm, with long fingers that wrapped naturally around pen shafts and trowel handles and the spines of books. She was tall, taller than her mother had been, taller than most of the men in Devizes, and she carried herself with the unconscious straightness of a person who has spent years standing at kitchen tables doing arithmetic in the dark. Her eyes were her best feature, and she did not know it. Gray-green, direct, startlingly focused. The kind of eyes that made people feel, correctly, that they were being assessed. She was not plain, exactly. That was never quite the right word, though people used it. She looked competent. That was the closest anyone ever came to it. She looked like a person who could lift things and fix things and figure things out, and in 1826, that was not what a girl was supposed to look like. Sir Edmund Waverly was the third baronet of his line. A baronet, for those unfamiliar with the English system of making men feel important, sat below the peerage. No seat in the House of Lords, no vast political influence, no dukedom or earldom or the weight that came with those. Just a sir, a country house, and the expectation of respectability. It was exactly the kind of title that made a man feel he mattered without giving him any of the tools to actually matter. His grandfather had built the estate from raw land through a combination of intelligence, discipline, and the kind of ruthless financial instinct that skips generations, appearing suddenly, brilliantly in one child, and vanishing completely in the next. It had vanished completely in Sir Edmund. He was not stupid. This matters, because the story that follows makes more sense when you understand exactly what he was. Sir Edmund was a man of average intelligence, born into a family that expected brilliance. His grandfather had doubled the estate's value in 20 years. His father had maintained it with steady competence and strategic investment. Sir Edmund could do neither. He could ride well, drink adequately, and maintain the appearance of a country gentleman whose affairs were in order, provided no one examined the affairs too closely. What he could not do was think ahead. Not the way his father had thought, with precision and foresight and the ability to see 3 decisions into the future. Sir Edmund thought in straight lines, in short distances, in the immediate and the obvious. He made decisions the way a man walks through fog, reacting to whatever appeared directly in front of him and hoping the larger landscape would sort itself out. It had not sorted itself out. The estate was bleeding money. Tenant farms that his grandfather had made profitable through innovative drainage and crop rotation were now managed with techniques 30 years out of date. The wool income had declined by 1/3 in a decade. 2 tenant families had left for factory work in the cities, and Sir Edmund had let them go because replacing tenants required effort, and effort required thinking, and thinking made his head ache. The roof of the east wing leaked in 4 places, and his solution had been to close the wing and pretend the problem had been solved. And into this household of declining fortune and defensive mediocrity, God had delivered a daughter who was smarter than everyone in it. Sir Edmund's wife, Helena, recognized what Katherine was. Helena had been a clergyman's daughter, educated, perceptive, the kind of woman who read widely and thought clearly. She had married Sir Edmund believing, the way women sometimes do, especially young ones, especially hopeful ones, that a kind husband was enough, that she could be happy with a man who was decent but not curious, as long as he was gentle. Sir Edmund was kind in the early years, kind and dull and content to let Helena manage the household while he managed the stables and the wine cellar. Helena ran the domestic accounts. Helena corresponded with the tenants. Helena, quietly and without credit, kept the gears of Waverly Hall turning while her husband occupied the study and believed he was in charge. Katherine watched her mother work. Katherine learned. Helena died when Katherine was 11. Consumption, arriving as a cough in February and departing as a coffin in May, when the wisteria on the south wall was in full bloom. Katherine sat beside her bed and held her hand, and did not cry, because Helena had asked her not to. "You are going to be fine," Helena whispered, though they both knew she was not talking about Katherine's feelings. She was talking about the estate, the accounts, the 200 small invisible tasks that kept Waverly Hall running, and that no one but Helena knew how to do. "I know how," Katherine said. Helena looked at her daughter, 11 years old, steady-eyed, already more capable than the man she had married, and something passed between them that did not need words. An inheritance that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with what one woman can hand to another when the world has decided that neither of them has anything worth handing down. "Be careful with your father," Helena said. "He does not know what you are. It is safer that way." She died that evening. Katherine closed her mother's eyes, kissed her forehead, walked downstairs, opened the household account book, and continued her mother's work. She was 11. Sir Edmund did not notice. He noticed that his meals continued appearing on time, that the household ran smoothly, that the accounts seemed to balance, and he attributed all of this to the natural order of things, the way a man who has never changed a wheel on a carriage assumes the carriage runs itself. When Katherine was 12, the estate steward, Mr. Hale, fell ill for 3 weeks. Mr. Hale was the only person besides Helena who had understood the full complexity of Waverly Hall's finances, the tenant agreements, the agricultural leases, the quarterly payments to creditors, the seasonal swings in wool and grain prices that determined whether the estate finished the year in surplus or deficit. During those 3 weeks, Sir Edmund should have managed the books himself. He did not. He sat in his study, drank port, and assumed things would sort themselves out. Katherine sorted them out. She was 12 years old. She sat at the kitchen table after her father went to bed, by the light of a single candle, and she worked through the estate accounts with a precision that would have been impressive in a woman of 40. She paid the creditors. She calculated the quarterly rents. She caught a discrepancy in the wool merchant's invoice, £14 overcharged, a sum that would have vanished into someone else's pocket, and corrected it, and left the corrected books on Mr. Hale's desk with a note. "I believe the Higgins invoice was in error. I have adjusted the figure. Please verify." Mr. Hale verified. The figure was correct. The 12-year-old girl had caught an error that he himself had missed for 2 quarters. When he returned to work, Mr. Hale went to Katherine. He found her in the kitchen garden, weeding. She was always in the kitchen garden. It was the one place in Waverly Hall where nobody asked her what she was doing or told her to stop. "You did this," he said, holding the ledger. Katherine looked up, soil on her large, capable hands, gray-green eyes steady. "Someone had to." "Your father doesn't know." "No. Do you want him to know?" She considered this for longer than a 12-year-old should need, to consider anything. "I don't think he should know," she said. Then, picking at the soil under her thumbnail, "He gets a look. When I say things he doesn't understand. He got it when I asked about the crop yields at dinner, like I'd done something rude. But I hadn't done anything. I'd just asked a question." She looked up. "If he finds out about the accounts, he'll get the look again. And then something bad will happen. I don't know what, but something." She was 12, and she already understood her father better than his wife had, better than his steward did, better than anyone. She just didn't have the words for it yet. The words would come later. The understanding was already complete. Mr. Hale looked at this child, serious, soil-handed, preternaturally calm, and made a decision that would shape the next 13 years. "I will present your work as mine," he said. "When the accounts need doing, I will bring them to you. When decisions need making, I will consult you. Your father will believe I am managing the estate. You will actually manage it." "That seems dishonest," Katherine said. "It seems practical." A pause. "Practical is acceptable." And so began the arrangement that would save Waverly Hall. For 13 years, Katherine Waverly ran the estate. Not in the way a woman was supposed to manage a household, the menus, the linens, the servant schedules. She ran the entire operation: agricultural planning, tenant negotiations, debt management, capital improvements that kept the land productive when every estate in the county was contracting. She did it through Mr. Hale, who presented her decisions as his own. She did it in the early hours of the morning and the late hours of the night by candlelight. 1 candle per week, because asking for more would raise questions she could not answer. She did it in a leather-bound ledger hidden under the floorboard of her unheated room, because keeping the records in the study would have meant revealing herself, and revealing herself would have meant losing the only power she had. The results were extraordinary. Under Katherine's invisible management, the estate's wool income increased by 40% over 5 years. She negotiated a new lease with the Stratton tenant farm that brought in an additional £60 per year. She identified a drainage problem in the lower fields, a problem her grandfather had solved and her father had allowed to recur through sheer neglect. And she directed Mr. Hale to hire a drainage contractor, funding the work from savings she had built up by cutting waste in the household accounts. And she diversified. This was the decision that most impressed James later, when he found it in the records, because in 1842, 3 years before the crisis hit, Katherine had quietly reduced the estate's dependence on grain and expanded the wool operation. She could see what was coming. The corn laws were unsustainable. Grain prices would fall. Estates that relied on grain alone would bleed. She repositioned Waverly Hall before the wound opened, using a strategy she worked out on paper at her kitchen table at 4 in the morning, and her father did not notice because her father never noticed. Sir Edmund took credit for all of it. He presented the improved figures at the County Agricultural Society meetings. He accepted compliments from neighboring landowners on his sound management. He sat in the pub in Devizes and described the drainage project as though he had conceived it himself, over a pint of ale, to men who nodded approvingly, because Sir Edmund Waverly had finally, it seemed, grown into his inheritance. Katherine heard about these conversations second-hand. Mr. Hale reported them on his evening visits to the kitchen, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands and his jaw tight. "He told Mr. Stratton that the lease renegotiation was his idea," Mr. Hale said one evening, while Katherine reconciled the quarterly accounts by the last inch of that week's candle. "I know. He said he spent a month studying the terms. He did not read the original lease. I know because I checked. It was exactly where I left it, in the 3rd drawer of the study desk, with my pencil marks still in the margin." "Does it not—" Mr. Hale stopped himself. "Does it not what? Make me angry?" Katherine set down her pen. She looked tired. Not performatively tired, actually tired, the way a person looks at the end of a day that started at 4 in the morning and will not end until the candle runs out. "I used to think about it, whether it was fair, whether I should be angry, but that was, I don't know, years ago. It doesn't change anything being angry. The estate is solvent, the tenants are fed, the numbers are right. Those things are true, whether he knows I did them or not." She paused. "I suppose what I mean is, it gets done either way. And getting it done is the part that's mine. He can't take that." She picked up her pen and continued writing. Mr. Hale stood in the kitchen doorway and did not know what to do with his hands. He wanted to say something. He had wanted to say something for years, about the unfairness of it, about the waste, about the fact that the most capable person he had ever worked with was a woman doing someone else's job by candlelight in a room that nobody bothered to heat. But what do you say? What words are adequate? He had never found them, so he stood there, holding his hat, and watched her write, and the candle guttered in the draught from the door, and neither of them spoke, and eventually he went home. But a person cannot remain invisible forever, especially when the man who benefits most from her invisibility is determined to make it permanent. Sir Edmund's cruelty was not dramatic. He did not strike Katherine. He did not lock her in rooms or deny her food or rage at her in the hallways. He was not a villain from a Gothic novel. He was something more common and, in many ways, more corrosive. A man of fragile ego who had discovered early in his daughter's childhood that she was smarter than him, and who had spent 20 years punishing her for it in ways so quiet, so incremental, so woven into daily life that an outsider would have struggled to point to any single act and call it cruel. He dismissed her governess when Katherine was 13. He told the vicar's wife that Katherine's education was complete. She could read, write, and manage basic tasks, and further learning was unnecessary. He did not mention that the real reason was a letter from the governess, Miss Turner, praising Katherine's exceptional aptitude for mathematics and suggesting advanced instruction. The letter frightened him. He burned it. He stopped including Katherine at meals when she was 15. Not openly, he simply began assigning her tasks at the precise moment dinner was served, tasks that appeared urgent but were not. "Katherine, the silver needs polishing before the vicar arrives. Katherine, the kitchen ledger seems disordered. Would you sort it?" Always something, always urgent, always timed to coincide with the meal so that her absence looked voluntary. When the vicar's wife asked once about Katherine's absence from a parish dinner, Sir Edmund smiled the smile he kept for these occasions and said, "Katherine prefers her own company. She's a quiet girl, simple tastes." The word simple. In the careful, coded language of English social life, calling a woman simple was one step above calling her slow. It carried the suggestion, never stated outright, that Katherine was not quite capable, not quite sharp, not quite the kind of woman who could hold her own in conversation. It was a word that closed doors without anyone hearing them shut. Katherine heard what her father said about her. She heard it from servants who reported it out of loyalty and from neighbours who repeated it out of carelessness. She heard it the way you hear a clock in a room you have lived in for years, always there, always ticking, so constant that you forget about it until someone mentions the noise, and suddenly it is the only thing you can hear. She did not confront him. Confrontation required the belief that he could change. Katherine, who understood her father with clinical precision, knew that he could not. Sir Edmund was not cruel because he chose to be. He was cruel because his daughter's intelligence was a threat to the story he told himself about who he was. If Katherine was simple, then his mediocrity was adequate. If Katherine was incapable, then his capability was sufficient. The lie about her was the foundation of the truth about himself. He would maintain it to his grave, which, as it turned out, he did. Sir Edmund died on a Thursday in January of 1845 at the age of 57. Pneumonia, complicated by the accumulated consequences of 30 years, of port. He died in his warm study, in his warm chair, by his warm fire, while his daughter sat in her unheated room upstairs and entered the final quarter's accounts into the hidden ledger by the light of her last candle of the week. Mrs. Kemp brought her the news at 6:30. "Miss Katherine." The housekeeper's voice was careful, controlled, the voice of a woman holding something breakable. "Your father has passed." Katherine set down her pen, closed the ledger, slid it under the floorboard. "When?" "Sometime in the night. Thomas found him this morning. He was in his chair. Katherine nodded. She stood. She smoothed her gray dress, the same gray dress she wore every day, her mother's, let out 3 times and patched twice, now so familiar it was less a garment and more a second skin. "Has Mr. Cartwright been sent for?" "Not yet, miss." "Send Thomas to Devise's. Mr. Cartwright will need to see the will. And send word to Mr. Fenton in Norwich. He is the nearest male relation and will expect to be informed." Mrs. Kemp stared at her. "Miss Katherine, your father has just died." "Yes." Katherine met her eyes. "And there are things that need doing. If I do not do them, who will?" Mrs. Kemp opened her mouth, closed it, nodded. She had watched this girl manage funerals and floods and financial crises since the age of 11. She was not surprised. She was heartbroken, which is different. Katherine went downstairs to her father's study. She stood in the doorway and looked at the chair where he had spent the last 30 years. The warm chair, by the warm fire, in the warm room that he had kept comfortable for himself, while the rest of the house shrank around him like a body losing blood. She did not cry. She did not feel grief exactly. She felt the absence of something. Not love, which had never been present, but the constant low hum of vigilance that had filled her every waking moment for 13 years, the need to manage, to conceal, to produce results without being seen producing them, to keep the estate alive while pretending she had nothing to do with its survival. That hum was gone now, and in its place was a silence so large she could not find the edges of it. She walked to his desk. She opened the 3rd drawer, and she found the will. She had not been looking for it. She had been looking for the quarterly creditor schedule which she needed before Mr. Cartwright arrived. The will was underneath, in a sealed envelope, addressed to Mr. Cartwright in her father's cramped, uneven hand. Katherine looked at the envelope. She should not open it. It was a legal document intended for the solicitor. Opening it would be improper. Opening it would be, technically, a violation. She opened it. She read it standing up by the gray light of a January morning in a study that still smelled of her father's port and her father's pipe and her father's particular brand of comfortable oblivion. The will was short. Sir Edmund had never been a man of many words when fewer would do. He left the estate, the house, the land, the livestock, and all liquid assets to his nearest male relative, Mr. Dudley Fenton of Norwich. He left the contents of the wine cellar to the vicar, a gesture so transparently calculated to ensure favorable sermons at his funeral that Katherine almost laughed. And then the final clause. "And to my eldest daughter, Katherine Waverly, I leave nothing." Not just nothing, nothing as a deliberate act, nothing underlined, nothing insisted upon, nothing turned into a weapon and aimed directly at a woman who had kept the man's estate running for 13 years while he sat in his chair and drank port and told people she was simple. Katherine read the clause twice. She folded the will. She returned it to the envelope. She placed it back in the drawer exactly where she had found it, and she went to the kitchen to tell Mrs. Kemp that the creditor's schedule would need to be retrieved from Mr. Hale's office. Then she went upstairs to her cold room and sat on her narrow bed and pressed her hands flat against her thighs to stop them shaking. Not from grief, not from shock, from the physical exhaustion of a woman who has just been told by the person who was supposed to love her most that 13 years of her life were worth exactly nothing. She sat there for 7 minutes. She counted. Then she stood, washed her face in the basin of cold water, and went back to work. There were accounts to reconcile, tenants to notify, arrangements to make for a funeral that she would organize, that she would pay for out of the household funds she had managed for over a decade, and at which she would stand in the back row in her gray dress, while the vicar praised Sir Edmund Waverley's stewardship of the land and his dedication to his family. She would stand there, and she would not correct the record. She had been invisible for 13 years. She could be invisible for one more. Afternoon. Katherine had consulted a solicitor once about wills, 2 years before her father died, in secret. She had walked to Devizes on a market day, found a solicitor's office above a draper's shop, given a false name, and paid 3 shillings. She could not afford to ask one question. Can a daughter challenge her father's will? The solicitor was young, recently qualified. He had not yet learned to be indifferent to the injustices his profession administered. He explained carefully, as if handling something sharp, that under English common law a father could disinherit a daughter for any reason or none at all, that no court would intervene as long as the will was properly witnessed and the testator of sound mind, that a legal challenge required solicitors, and solicitors required fees, and fees required money that a disinherited woman, by definition, did not have. And here is the thing that makes me angriest about this, if I am being honest. The system knew. The men who wrote these laws knew that they were creating a closed loop. A woman who has been disinherited has no money. A woman who has no money cannot hire a solicitor. A woman who cannot hire a solicitor cannot challenge the disinheritance. Round and round. It was not an oversight. It was architecture. They built it this way on purpose, and they knew exactly what it did, and they did it anyway. I'm sorry I said I would not interrupt the story, but I needed you to hear that, because Katherine heard it in that office above the draper's shop, from a young man who was kind enough to look uncomfortable while explaining it. The law was not broken. The law was working exactly as designed. It was built to let men like her father decide what women like her were worth, and her father had decided she was worth nothing. The solicitor charged her the 3 shillings. She walked home in the rain, and she kept managing the estate for 2 more years, knowing that when her father died, everything she had built would be credited to someone else, and she would be left with nothing but the knowledge that she had done it. She told herself that knowing she'd done it would have to be enough, that at least the work existed, even if nobody would ever attach her name to it. She almost believed it some days. 3 weeks after Sir Edmund's death, the will was read. Katherine sat in the chair nearest the door and did not flinch. She already knew, and Dudley Fenton, her father's cousin, became the owner of Waverly Hall. Dudley was not a villain. This matters. He was not Sir Edmund, whose cruelty was strategic and personal. Dudley was something more ordinary and in some ways more contemptible. A weak man handed an opportunity he had not earned and could not manage. 42, unmarried, a former clerk who had spent 20 years in a counting-house in Norwich and been adequate at his work in the way a cart-horse is adequate at pulling. Steady, uncomplaining, limited. He had never owned property, never managed land, never supervised servants or negotiated with tenants or calculated a crop rotation. And he knew, within the first hour of walking through Waverly Hall, that he was hopelessly out of his depth. Katherine watched him. She watched him walk through the house on the first morning, his borrowed coat slightly too large, his face swinging between delight and terror, and she recognized the expression. Her father had worn it for 30 years. The look of a man who has been given something he does not understand and who is praying no one will ask him to explain it. The difference was simple. Sir Edmund had hidden behind Katherine's invisible labor. Dudley did not yet know that Katherine's invisible labor existed. Dudley's offer came on the 3rd day. He found Katherine in the kitchen garden and made his proposal with the awkward generosity of a man who wants you to notice how kind he is being. "Katherine, may I call you Katherine? We are family, after all." "Miss Waverly is customary." Dudley blinked. Yes, well, Miss Waverly, I wanted to speak with you about your situation. Katherine waited. I understand that the will leaves you, that is to say, your father's wishes were, well, he swallowed. I would like to offer you a home, here, at Waverly Hall, for as long as you need. Katherine looked at him with the expression she reserved for ledgers that didn't balance, patient, forensic, attentive to what was being said and what was being hidden. In what capacity? I beg your pardon? In what capacity would I remain? As a guest? A dependent? A companion? The terms matter, Mr. Fenton, because they determine my legal standing, my access to the household, and whether I have any recourse if you decide, at some future date, that your generosity has run its course. No one had told Dudley that Katherine Waverly was capable of constructing a sentence like that. Everyone had told him she was simple. I had not considered the specifics, he managed. I have. Katherine set down the trowel. If I am to remain here, I require 3 things. A room, my current room is acceptable, a wage, even a modest one, because a woman without income is a woman without options, and I have spent enough of my life without options, and access to the study. The study. I read, Mr. Fenton. Your father said, my father said many things. Not all of them were true. Silence. Dudley looked at Katherine. Katherine looked at Dudley. And in that silence something shifted, not visibly, but the way a wall shifts when you remove a load-bearing beam. Dudley realized, dimly and uncomfortably, that the woman kneeling in the kitchen garden was not what he had been told, and Katherine realized that he was going to agree, not because he was generous, but because he was frightened, and frightened men make concessions. I suppose that would be acceptable, Dudley said. Good, I will draw up the terms in writing. Is that really necessary? Mr. Fenton. Katherine's voice was calm and completely without warmth. The last arrangement I operated under was unwritten. It lasted 13 years and ended with a will that gave me nothing. I will not make that mistake again. Everything in writing, everything signed. He signed. Katherine Waverly, the daughter who had been left nothing, negotiated herself a wage, a room, and a key to the study. The first formal acknowledgment, however small, that her existence at Waverly Hall was a matter of contract, not charity. It was not victory. It was survival. But Katherine had learned long ago that survival is the foundation on which everything else is built. Before we go on, if you are listening for the first time, welcome. If you are coming back, welcome home. Drop your city in the comments. I read everyone. Now, I need to take you to London, to a solicitor's office on Chancery Lane, where a man has just read, "This will and is getting angrier with every sentence." James Cavendish, the 7th Duke of Ashworth, had not planned to be in London that week. He had been at his estate in Hampshire, reviewing accounts. He reviewed his own accounts personally, which was unusual for a duke, and which his solicitor found both admirable and slightly exhausting, when the letter arrived from Mr. Cartwright's office. The letter contained 2 things: a copy of Sir Edmund Waverley's will, and a note explaining that the Duke of Ashworth was named as executor. This required explanation. The Ashworths and the Waverleys had no social connection, no shared business, no family ties, no reason to be tangled in each other's affairs. But Sir Edmund had named the Duke of Ashworth as executor deliberately, not out of friendship, out of strategy. Here is what Sir Edmund understood, in his narrow, self-serving way. A will that disinherits a daughter looks vindictive. It invites scrutiny. It invites sympathy for the girl. But a will that disinherits a daughter and is executed by a duke, by one of the most respected names in the south of England, looks considered. looks legitimate, looks like a decision made by serious men for serious reasons. Sir Edmund had written to the Duke's solicitor 2 years before his death, requesting the executorship as a professional arrangement, routine, compensated, a matter of legal prestige. The old Duke, James's predecessor, his brother Frederick, had agreed before he died. The obligation had passed to James, along with the title, the estates, and the 40,000 a year. James had never met the Waverleys. He knew nothing about them except what the filed documents told him. A baronetcy, an estate in Wiltshire, a family in decline. Sir Edmund had chosen the most powerful name he could find to lend authority to his cruelty. He did not know, could not have imagined, that the man who inherited that name had his own history with wills that said nothing. He sat in his solicitor's office and read the will. He read it once, quickly, with the efficient, absorbing attention of a man who had been managing complex estates since he was 22. He noted the standard clauses. He noted the wine cellar bequest, which told him about the dead man's priorities. He noted the inheritance passing to a cousin in Norwich, which told him about the dead man's planning. And then the final clause. "And to my eldest daughter, Katherine Waverly, I leave nothing." James stopped. He went back, read it again. No income, no provision, no claim. A third time. A deliberate and considered judgment upon her character. He set down the document. He removed his spectacles, wire-rimmed, slightly bent at the left temple where he had a habit of pulling them off one-handed, and pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose. "Mr. Ainsworth," he said. His solicitor looked up. "Your Grace?" "A deliberate and considered judgment upon her character." James's voice had gone quiet. People who knew him well had learned what that quiet meant. Those are the words a man uses when he wants to wound someone from beyond the grave, when he wants the solicitor to read it aloud in front of witnesses so that the shame is public and permanent. "It is unusual phrasing," Mr. Ainsworth conceded. "It is cruelty with legal formatting." James put his spectacles back on. "What do we know about the daughter?" "Very little, Your Grace. The local intelligence suggests she is unremarkable. The father described her as simple." "Simple. That is the word used." James said nothing for a long time. He was still looking at the will, but his eyes had gone somewhere else, somewhere 18 years away, to a small house in Cheapside where a woman with his nose and his jaw and his way of tilting her head when she was thinking had lived in 2 rooms with a husband who could not balance a ledger and a child. She could not afford to feed. Eleanor, his sister, 4 years younger, brilliant, more brilliant than him, which he said not as modesty but as fact. She had married a clerk at 20, a good man, a kind man, a man with no money and no name and no connections, but who loved her. Their father, the 6th Duke, had disinherited her. The will had used specific language. A deliberate judgment upon her character. Eleanor had managed her husband's failing business, had turned it profitable, had done the accounts, the strategy, the planning, all of it invisible, all of it credited to a husband who told his friends she was a burden. She died at 26, a fever, treatable if they could have afforded a physician. They could not afford a physician because the old Duke's will had ensured that Eleanor had nothing, no inheritance, no safety net, no way out. Her last letter to James said, "I kept his books, I saved his business, and he told his friends I was a burden." James had been 19, at Oxford, studying law, preparing for the career their father considered acceptable for a second son who would never inherit. The title was going to Frederick, the eldest. James was the spare, useful, tolerated, disposable. Frederick died of typhoid the following year, and James inherited everything: the title, the estates, £40,000 a year, the seat in the House of Lords, and the will, his father's will, that had killed his sister as surely as the fever had. His first act as Duke had been to find Eleanor's grave. His second had been to establish a trust for her son, his nephew, 3 years old, living in a parish charity because both parents were dead. His third had been to read his father's will one final time, slowly and completely, and place it in the fireplace. He had watched the paper curl and blacken, and told himself, not God, not Eleanor's ghost, himself, that if he ever found a man doing to his daughter what the old Duke had done to Eleanor, he would not look away. Not again. He was 19 when he made that promise. He was 37 now, and he was sitting in a solicitor's office reading a will that used the same words. "Get me a horse," he said. "Your Grace, the executorship can be managed by correspondence. A visit is not strictly, 'Get me a horse,' and send word to Waverly Hall that I will arrive on Friday." Mr. Ainsworth had seen the Duke's face look like this once before, 4 years ago, when a member of Parliament made a remark about working women in the Duke's hearing, and the Duke spent the following 6 months methodically dismantling the man's political career. The Duke was not angry. Anger was too small. Something older had been activated. Mr. Ainsworth sent for the horse. James arrived at Waverly Hall on a Friday afternoon in February. 3 days of winter roads, mud, rutted tracks, a cold rain that started in Berkshire and followed him into Wiltshire like an unwelcome thought. He had ridden rather than taken a carriage, because carriages were slow and because riding gave him time to think, and James thought best when his body was occupied and his mind could roam. By the time he turned up the drive, he had read the will 4 more times. He had memorized the clause about Katherine, and he had reviewed the estate's filed accounts, the public ones submitted to the county registrar, and noticed something that did not add up. The accounts were good, too good. The crop yields, the debt management, the tenant retention. These were the numbers of an estate run by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. But the estate was owned by a man whose reputation, by all reports, was cheerful incompetence. And the steward, Mr. Hale, was 60, competent but not inventive. The kind of man who maintains systems but does not build them. Someone else was producing these numbers, someone whose name did not appear on any document. James had a theory. Theories, in his experience, were better confirmed than announced. He was met at the door by the butler, Mr. Thorpe, who was elderly and correct, and who betrayed no surprise at the arrival of a duke, because butlers are trained to betray no surprise at anything, including fires, floods, and the second coming. "The Duke of Ashworth," Mr. Thorpe said. "You are correct. Is Miss Waverly at home?" A pause. The briefest hesitation, so brief that most people would have missed it. James did not miss it. "Miss Waverly is in the kitchen garden, Your Grace." "Of course she is." He did not go to the study. He did not meet Dudley Fenton first, as protocol required. He walked around the side of the house, following the gravel path to the walled garden at the rear, and he found Katherine Waverly on her knees in the soil, with a trowel in one hand and a leather-bound ledger tucked under her arm. He saw the ledger first. Not her face, not her hair. The ledger. It was thick, soft, with handling, the pages slightly warped from years of being written in by insufficient light. It was not a household account book. Those were smaller, thinner. This was an estate ledger, the kind that held crop plans and tenant agreements and financial projections, the kind that belonged in a study, not a kitchen garden, and certainly not under the arm of a woman the world had described as simple. Katherine looked up. She saw a tall man at the garden gate, lean, slightly stooped from years of reading, with spectacles that caught the gray February light, and sandy hair flattened on one side from 3 days in the saddle. His coat was well made, but not showy, mud-spattered to the knees. His hands were at his sides, and his expression, she could not place it, not cold, not warm, focused, the expression of a man cataloguing details before deciding what they mean. She stood, soil on her hands, ledger under her arm, chin level. "You are the executor," she said. "Not a question. I am James Cavendish." He paused, as if deciding whether to add his title, and then didn't. Katherine noticed. "Miss Waverly, you have come a long way, Your Grace." Yes, I have, and I am not—" He stopped. He had been about to say something. He changed his mind. "The study is inside, I take it. Mr. Fenton will be expecting me." "I expect he will. The study is through the main hall, first door on the left." "Thank you, but I am not here for Mr. Fenton." Katherine's hand tightened on the trowel. "May I ask what that is?" he said, indicating the ledger. "A notebook." "It is not a notebook. It is an estate ledger. I can see the column formatting through the cover." She said nothing. "Miss Waverly, I have reviewed the filed accounts for this estate, the crop yields, the debt management, the tenant retention. The numbers are exceptional. They are the work of someone with a thorough command of agricultural economics and financial strategy." She said nothing. "Your father was not that person. Mr. Hale, while capable, is a steward. He maintains. He does not build. Someone built these systems. Someone restructured the debt. Someone identified the drainage problem. And that someone is standing in this garden, holding the evidence under her arm and hoping I will not ask about it." Silence. A blackbird in the hedge. February wind through the garden, carrying cold soil and the far-off threat of rain. Katherine looked at this man who had ridden 3 days from London to ask a question that no one had ever asked, who had read the accounts and seen the shape of her work in the numbers, the way you see the shape of wind in the bend of a tree, and felt something shift in her chest. Not hope. Something more dangerous, the feeling of being looked at by someone who was actually paying attention. "Yes," she said, steady, flat. "I built these systems. I have managed this estate for 13 years. Every crop plan, every tenant agreement, every debt, restructuring, every figure in those filed accounts, mine, presented under Mr. Hale's name, credited to my father, and my reward was a will that says I deserve nothing." She held the ledger out to him, not desperately, not defiantly. The way you hand over evidence when you have decided that the truth, whatever it costs, is better than one more day of hiding. "This is the real ledger, 13 years, every entry in my hand. You want to know who managed this estate? Read it." James took the ledger, opened it, looked at the first page. September 1832, neat columns, precise figures, the handwriting of a 16-year-old girl running an estate she wasn't supposed to understand, who had already developed a notation system more efficient than anything his own stewards used. He turned the pages. He read the way he always read, fast, completely, absorbing. Katherine watched his eyes move. She watched his expression shift in small increments, a narrowing at the drainage, calculation, a fractional lift of the eyebrows at the wool merchant negotiation, a moment where his jaw tightened, and she knew. He had reached the page where she recorded the Stratton lease savings, the deal her father described to the Agricultural Society as his own proudest achievement. James closed the ledger. He looked at Katherine. "The will is wrong," he said. 2 words. Quiet. No drama, the simple conviction of a man stating something he considers self-evident, not unfair, not cruel, not a travesty or an injustice. Wrong, as in factually incorrect. The document says she deserves nothing, and the evidence in his hands says the document is a lie. No one had ever called her father wrong before, not to her face, not about her. "The law disagrees with you," she said. "The law is frequently wrong. That is why it requires executors." He tucked the ledger under his own arm, carefully the way you carry something that matters, and walked toward the house. "I will need access to the study," he said over his shoulder, "and I will need to speak with Mr. Hale, and I would like a cup of tea, if that is not too much trouble. I have been riding for 3 days, and I have not had a proper cup since Berkshire." Katherine stared at his retreating back. This lean, spectacled, mud-spattered stranger had just done something no one in her 29 years had ever done. He had read her numbers, and he had said, without hesitation, without qualification, without the slightest surprise that a woman had produced them, that the will was wrong. She stood in the garden for a long moment. The blackbirds sang. Then Katherine Waverly did something she had not done in 13 years. She followed someone. The days that followed were unlike anything in Katherine's experience. James Cavendish settled into Waverly Hall with the efficiency of a man accustomed to occupying spaces that were not his and making them productive. He took the morning room, not the study, which was technically Dudley's territory, but a smaller, colder room on the north side that had not been used in years, and that Katherine had always privately liked, because the light was steady, and you could see both the drive and the garden from the desk. He had the desk moved to face the window. He had a fire lit. He had Mrs. Kemp bring tea at 8 and again at 3, and he sat at that desk for 14 hours a day, reading. He read everything, filed accounts, estate correspondence, tenant agreements going back 20 years, agricultural society records, county registrar documentation, probate filings. He read with the tireless absorption of a man assembling a picture from fragments, pieces that no one else had thought to put together. And at intervals, morning, afternoon, sometimes evening, he asked Katherine to join him. These conversations were not romantic. They were not gentle or tentative or accompanied by lingering looks across candlelit rooms. They were interrogations, thorough, precise, deeply specific interrogations by a man who understood estate management at a level Katherine had never encountered, and who treated her, without comment, without fuss, as his equal. "Walk me through the drainage project," he said on the second day. "The lower fields. You identified the problem in, let me check, 1838? 1837. The autumn flooding was worse that year. I noticed the water table had risen in the southeast corner, which meant the old channels, my grandfather's, from 1810, had silted up. How did you confirm it?" "I walked the fields, in November, in the rain." "Alone?" "Mr. Hale has a bad knee, and the problem needed confirming before the winter rains made it worse." "You walked flooded fields alone in November to confirm a drainage hypothesis." "The hypothesis was correct. The channels were silted. I hired a drainage contractor from Devizes, Mr. Bellamy, who had done work for the Chandos estate, and had the channels cleared and extended. Cost, £38. Yield increase the following spring, approximately £90. Net benefit over 2 years, £142. James had taken off his spectacles. That habit, removing them when he was thinking, replacing them when he was reading. Katherine had already begun reading his mental state by whether the spectacles were on his face or in his hand. £142, he said, "and your father took credit. He presented the yield figures at the Agricultural Society dinner, described the drainage project as a sound investment based on careful observation." His exact words. I wrote them down. You wrote them down. I write everything down, Your Grace. The ledger is a complete record. Every decision, every figure, every instance of work done and credit taken. Why? Katherine paused. The first time in these conversations that she had hesitated, because I wanted proof, not for anyone else, for myself. I wanted to open that ledger at any time and see, in my own handwriting, the evidence that I existed, that I did this, that whatever the world said about me, the numbers were mine. James put his spectacles back on, looked at the ledger, looked at Katherine. "Miss Waverly, this is the most comprehensive estate management document I have ever seen. I manage 3 estates. My chief steward has 40 years' experience, and the system you have built, alone, in secret, without support, is more sophisticated than anything in my operation." The crack in Katherine's chest widened. She pressed her hand flat against the desk. "That is kind of you to say." He looked up from the ledger with an expression that suggested she had said something faintly ridiculous. "It is not kind. It is... I am describing what is in front of me. The system works. The numbers are sound. That is not kindness, Miss Waverly. That is observation." Conversations continued. Each day James went deeper into the records, and each day he asked Katherine to walk him through another layer of her 13-year project. On the third day, they argued, it happened over the wool merchant negotiation. The deal Katherine had brokered in 1840 through Mr. Hale by letter that had increased the estate's wool income by almost a third. James had been reading the correspondence and found what he considered a flaw. "You accepted Gould's second offer without countering," he said. "The correspondence shows he was prepared to go higher. He opened at 6 shillings per stone. You countered at 8. He came back at 7 and 3 pence. You accepted. But his response time, 4 days rather than his usual 7, indicates he had room to move. You left money on the table." Katherine set down her tea. "I did not leave money on the table." The pattern of his responses suggests. "The pattern? No. Wait." She held up a hand. She did this, sometimes, stopped herself mid-sentence when her thoughts were moving faster than her mouth. "Let me show you. Look at the 1841 figures. Not the 1840 negotiation, the 1841 figures. Why? Because the 1840 deal was not a single negotiation. It was the first move in a longer one." She pulled the ledger toward her, flipped pages, found the entry. Gould had been short-changing the estate, approximately 2% per delivery for 3 years. I found the discrepancy the week before negotiations opened. When he came back at 7 and 3 pence, I took it. Not because it was his ceiling. You're right, it probably wasn't. But because the 7 and 3 pence plus, his fear that I knew about the discrepancy, was worth more than 8 shillings from a merchant who resented the deal. You're telling me you deliberately accepted a lower price. I'm telling you I accepted a lower price in 1840 so I could get a higher one in 1841. Which I did. 8 shillings. Look, James. Looked. He was quiet for a while. Then, "That's all right. But the risk, if he'd called your bluff on the discrepancy, he wouldn't have. Men who cheat by 2% are not men who want attention drawn to their accounts." "You can't know that." "I knew Gould. I'd been corresponding with him for 4 years through Mr. Hale. He was a man who rounded down when he thought no one was checking and rounded up when he thought someone was. Predictable. Manageable. The kind of dishonesty you can use if you're patient." She stopped. She realized, with a small flush of something that might have been embarrassment, that she had been talking for a long time. She was not used to explaining herself. She was used to writing things in a ledger and having the numbers speak. James was staring at her, not with the composed assessment he usually wore, with something less tidy. He looked like a man who'd picked up what he thought was a simple account book and found a novel inside. "I should have checked the ledger before questioning you," he said. "Yes, you should have." "That will probably happen again." "Almost certainly." She picked up her tea. "But I don't mind explaining. I've never—" She stopped again. "Nobody's ever asked before about why I made the decisions I made, just whether the numbers were right." That landed somewhere in the room and stayed there. Neither of them picked it up. James took a sip of tea. Katherine took a sip of tea, and the silence that followed was the kind where something has shifted, but neither person is ready to name it. On the fourth day, James asked about the tenant restructuring, the system Katherine had devised for rotating lease terms so that no more than 2 tenancies expired in the same year, reducing the estate's vulnerability to simultaneous vacancies. "The vacancy rate for the 7 years prior to my system was approximately 14% annually," Katherine said, walking him through the figures. "Some years. Worse. In 1836, 3 tenancies expired simultaneously, and 2 were not renewed. My father lost nearly £100 in a single quarter." "And after you implemented the rotation?" 0 vacancies for 7 consecutive years." James shook his head. "That should not be possible. Tenant retention in this county averages 82%, I know, but the county average includes estates that treat tenants as interchangeable. I do not. When the Marsden farm came up for renewal in 1839, I learned through Mr. Hale that the family was considering leaving for factory work in Bristol. The youngest son had been offered a position. The father was tempted by the wages." "What did you do?" "I reduced their rent by £4 per year and renegotiated the grazing rights on the north field to give them access to an additional 3 acres. The cost to the estate was approximately £6 annually. The value of retaining an experienced tenant family, one that knew the land, maintained the buildings and required no transition period, was approximately £30 per year in avoided costs and uninterrupted production." "You ran a cost-benefit analysis on tenant retention." "I ran a cost-benefit analysis on everything, Your Grace. It is the only way to make decisions that survive scrutiny." She paused. Something crossed her face that James hadn't seen before. Not the analytical expression, not the careful blankness. Something less defended. "Also, the Marsdens have a daughter, Sarah. She is 9. She brings me blackberries from the hedgerow in September and tells me about the fox she has been watching in the lower field. I did not want Sarah Marsden to move to Bristol and grow up in a factory tenement and never see a fox again." She caught herself, straightened. The cost-benefit analysis was sound, but Sarah was also a factor. Both things can be true. James looked at her for a moment. He did not write anything in his ledger. Some things, he was beginning to understand, did not belong in ledgers. James wrote something in his own ledger. Katherine glanced at it and stopped. His notation system, the column headers, the way he organized subtotals, it was almost identical to hers. "Your ledger," she said. He looked up. "Your notation system, it is very similar to mine." James glanced down at his own page, then at Katherine's ledger, open on the desk between them. A beat of recognition. They had arrived at the same solution independently. 2 people who thought the same way, separated by circumstance and gender, and a legal system that had decided one of them mattered and the other did not. "It appears we read the same books," he said. It appears we reached the same conclusions. That evening, after James retired to the guest room, Mrs. Kemp found Katherine in the kitchen. Katherine was not working. She was sitting at the table with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold, staring at the far wall with an expression that Mrs. Kemp had not seen on her face in 13 years. She looked confused. "Miss Katherine." Katherine blinked. "Yes." Mrs. Kemp sat down across from her. She did not ask permission. 31 years in this house had earned her certain rights, and sitting down uninvited was one of them. "The Duke," Mrs. Kemp said. "What about him?" "He seems—" Mrs. Kemp stopped. She had been about to say kind, but that wasn't it. Kindness was what you said about vicars and elderly neighbours. What the Duke was doing was not kind. It was something else. She tried again. "He pours you tea." "He pours tea for himself. He pours a second cup because I happen to be present. He pours yours first, before his own. Every time." Katherine opened her mouth, closed it. She had not noticed that. Or she had noticed it the way you notice the temperature changing, not consciously, not as a fact, but as a shift in the room that you feel before you understand. "It does not signify," Katherine said. Mrs. Kemp was quiet for a moment. She was trying to assemble something she had been carrying for 31 years and had never been able to say, and the words kept coming out in the wrong order. "I watched you," she said. "All these years, I watched you do everything, the accounts, the tenants, the drainage business, all of it, from that room with no fire, with your one candle." Her voice was shaking. She had not expected it to shake, and she was annoyed at herself. "I watched you read that will and not cry. I watched you stand at the back of his funeral in that gray dress." She stopped, breathed. "And tonight, when he asked you about the drainage, I was in the hallway. I wasn't listening on purpose. I was bringing wood for the fire. But I saw your face. How did I look?" Mrs. Kemp thought about it. She had a description ready, something about light or windows or air. But those were fancy words, and Mrs. Kemp was not a fancy woman. "You looked like somebody who'd forgotten what it was like," she said, "to have someone in the room who was actually paying attention, and it scared you." Katherine stared at her. "He sees you," Mrs. Kemp said. "That man sees what you are, and I don't think you know what to do about it, because nobody has, not your father, not anyone in this county. They all looked at you and saw what your father told them to see, and you let them. It was practical. It was what it was, and it's done now. Your father's dead and the will's been read, and there's a man in the morning room who rode 3 days because a piece of paper made him angry." Mrs. Kemp leaned forward. Her hands were still shaking. She wished they'd stop. "Let him be angry, Miss Katherine. Let him do what he came to do." Katherine said nothing for a long time. The kitchen was quiet. The fire had burned down to coals that ticked and shifted in the grate. Somewhere upstairs a door closed. The wind found a gap in the window, frame, and made a sound like someone breathing. "He's going to leave," Katherine said. Not a question. She said it flatly, the way she said things that she had already calculated the probability of and found unfavorable. "He might. And then it'll be—" She stopped. She had been about to say worse, but that wasn't right either. It wouldn't be worse. It would be exactly the same. That was the problem. It would be exactly the same as before, except now she would know what it felt like to have someone in the room who was paying attention, and that knowledge would sit alongside everything else she carried. The accounts, the secrets, the 13 years, and she would carry that too. She didn't say any of this. She pressed her lips together and looked at the cold tea in her hands. "I don't know how to do this," she said, very quietly. Mrs. Kemp reached across the table and put her hand over Katherine's. Rough on rough, work-worn on work-worn. "Nobody does?" Mrs. Kemp said. "That's not a reason." Katherine looked at Mrs. Kemp's hand on hers. She didn't pull away. For Katherine Waverly, that was the most she could give, and Mrs. Kemp, who had known her for 31 years, knew it. On the 5th day, James set down his tea and said, "I need to tell you something about why I am here. You are the executor. You are here to review the estate. I am here because of the will, but not the executorship." He paused. The spectacles came off. "I am here because of my sister." Katherine waited. She had learned in 5 days that James did not offer personal information without reason. "Her name was Eleanor. She was 4 years younger than me. She was—" He stopped, started again. "She was the most intelligent person I have ever known. More intelligent than me, and I say that as fact, not modesty. She had a mind that moved the way yours does, precisely, several steps ahead of the room." Katherine said nothing. "When she was 20, she married a clerk, a good man, a kind man. No money, no prospects, no connections, but he loved her and she loved him. My father disinherited her. The will used specific language." James looked at Katherine directly. It said, "a deliberate and considered judgment upon her character." The words landed like a stone in water. Katherine heard the echo of her own father's will in a dead duke's phrasing and understood, suddenly, completely, why this man was sitting in her morning room. "She managed her husband's accounts," James continued, "ran his small business, brilliant at it, turned a failing enterprise into a functioning one, the same kind of invisible management you have been doing for 13 years. No one knew. Her husband took the credit. The world saw a clerk's wife. She saw the truth, and she carried it alone. What happened to her? She died. Flat. Stripped. 26. A fever. Treatable. If they could have afforded a physician. They could not afford a physician because my father's will ensured she had nothing." He paused. "Her last letter to me said, 'I kept his books, I saved his business, and he told his friends I was a burden.'" The fire crackled. Outside, the February wind leaned against the windows. "I was 19, Oxford. I could not stop it, did not have the power or the money or the name. By the time Frederick died and I inherited, it was too late. Eleanor was gone. Her son was in a parish charity, and the will that killed her was still sitting in a solicitor's drawer. Legally valid. Beyond challenge." He put his spectacles on. "I burned it. My father's will. First thing I did as Duke. Took it from the office and burned it in my study. Changed nothing. Eleanor was still dead. But the document was wrong, and I would not let it exist." Katherine understood, completely, the way you understand a proof, each step leading to the next, the conclusion already visible in the first line. "And then you read my father's will," she said, "and it used the same words, same structure, same cruelty and legal dress. And you got on a horse. I got on a horse." A long silence, but not the uncomfortable kind, the kind where both people are thinking and neither feels the need to fill the gap. "You cannot overturn the will," Katherine said. "I consulted a solicitor. The law does not allow a daughter to challenge a properly executed will on grounds of cruelty. I know. I have spent 18 years studying the limits of inheritance law." "Then why are you here?" "Because a daughter cannot overturn it. An executor has different powers, and I have been reading your father's filed accounts very carefully." "What did you find?" James pulled 2 documents from the pile on the desk. "These are the accounts your father filed with the county registrar for 1842, and these," he placed her ledger beside them, are the real accounts from your records for the same year." Katherine looked at the two documents, saw it immediately. The discrepancy she had always known was there, but had never had reason to pursue, because pursuing it meant revealing her records, and revealing her records meant revealing herself. "The filed figures are different," she said. "Your father underreported estate income by approximately £200 per year for at least 5 years. The filed accounts show marginal surplus. Yours show substantial surplus. Surplus he was siphoning off. Where? That is what I intend to find out. But the discrepancy gives me, as executor, grounds to challenge the probate. If the estate's value was misrepresented in the filed documents, then the will was executed on fraudulent foundations. The probate can be reopened, the assets reassessed, and the distribution reconsidered." Katherine stared. "You are going to challenge the will." "I am going to correct the will. There is a difference." Katherine was quiet for a moment. "Chancery," she said. Not a question. She knew the legal system better than most solicitors, even if no solicitor would acknowledge it. "Yes, it will go through Chancery, which means months, possibly longer. The courts move slowly, particularly on probate disputes. There are cases in Chancery that have been open since before you were born. But the evidence is overwhelming. The outcome is not in doubt. Only the speed. Months. I will not leave until it is filed, and I will return as often as it requires." There it was again. Correct. The same precision as wrong, not emotional language, not outrage. The language of a man who sees an error and intends to fix it. She had never met anyone who spoke her language before. The investigation took 3 weeks. James worked through every filed document, every county record, every receipt and letter he could find. Mr. Hale testified. Finally released from 13 years of secrecy, sitting in the morning room for an entire afternoon, describing every decision Katherine had made. "She was 16 when she took over the accounts," Mr. Hale said. 16, and within a year she had identified inefficiencies I had missed for a decade. The Stratton lease, the drainage, the wool merchant. She negotiated that deal through me, by letter, because a woman could not conduct business under her own name. But every word was hers, every calculation, every strategy. Mrs. Kemp testified too. The unheated room, the one candle, the gray dress, the word simple. "She managed this estate from a room with no fire," Mrs. Kemp said, her voice trembling with 31 years of suppressed rage. "1 candle a week, 1. And her father sat downstairs drinking port that her work paid for and telling the world she was simple." James wrote it all down. His pen moved steadily. His face did not. At one point, Mrs. Kemp told Katherine about this later because Katherine had not been in the room, James set down his pen and said, "How did she heat water in the mornings?" "For washing." And Mrs. Kemp said, "She didn't. She washed in cold water. Every morning. For 13 years." And James looked at the wall for about 10 seconds without speaking, and when he picked the pen up again, his hand was not quite steady. It was the only time during the investigation that his hand was not steady, and Mrs. Kemp noticed, and she decided in that moment that the Duke of Ashworth was the right kind of man, because the right kind of man is not the one who never shakes, it is the one who shakes at the right things. And then he found the trust. Buried in the estate's oldest documents, a trust established by Katherine's mother, Helena, before her marriage. Helena's father, the clergyman, had settled £300 on his daughter in a separate trust that, under its specific terms, was not absorbed into her husband's estate upon marriage. Unusual for the time, but not unheard of. Some fathers, particularly those with educated daughters, took quiet steps to give their children a thread of independence. Sir Edmund had absorbed the trust into the estate accounts 4 years after Helena's death. He had not dissolved it legally. That would have required paperwork. He had simply begun drawing on it as though it were his, mingling the funds with estate income until the line between them vanished, except in Katherine's ledger. Where the trust appeared as a separate line item, tracked meticulously because Katherine had found the original trust document in her mother's papers at 14 and had followed the money ever since, £300 plus 17 years of accumulated interest. Katherine's own calculations put it at approximately £420. James brought the trust document to her on a Tuesday evening, placed it on the desk beside her ledger. "This is yours," he said. Katherine read it again, looked at the figure. "This was my mother's." "Yes, your father had no right to absorb it. The trust is separate from the estate. It survives the will. It is yours, Miss Waverly, regardless of what your father wrote. £420. Enough for a modest house, enough for independence, enough to walk away." Katherine pressed her hands flat on the desk and breathed. "There is more," James said. "The diverted funds, I traced them. Your father maintained a separate account at a bank in Bath. £600 at the time of his death. Money generated by the estate, by your management. Money that, under the will, would go to Fenton. But if the filed accounts are fraudulent, then the probate is compromised. The estate enters review under my authority, and I have considerable discretion in how the assets are redistributed. You are going to take the estate from Dudley. I am going to ensure the assets are distributed according to the truth rather than according to a document built on fraud. Your father lied in his accounts, lied about who managed the estate. And the will is the final lie. It says you deserve nothing. The ledger says otherwise." Dudley fought it. He hired a solicitor, Mr. Pettigrew of Devizes, a man of modest talent and immodest fees, who argued that the will was valid, that the accounts were the steward's responsibility, and that Miss Waverly's claims of involvement were— And here Mr. Pettigrew made the mistake that cost his client everything. Fanciful at best and delusional at worst, given the well-known limitations of her character. James received this letter on a Thursday morning. Read it once, removed his spectacles, set the letter down gently, the way you set down something that might explode. He wrote to Mr. Ainsworth that afternoon. "Mr. Pettigrew has described Miss Waverly's estate management as fanciful. Please respond with the following: the complete set of estate ledgers in Miss Waverly's hand, covering 13 years, Mr. Hale's sworn testimony, the wool merchant's correspondence, confirming all negotiations were conducted by Miss Waverly, the drainage contractor's invoice naming Miss Waverly as commissioning party, and the filed accounts showing the discrepancies. I believe the word Mr. Pettigrew wants is not fanciful. It is extraordinary. Ensure he understands the distinction. Mr. Pettigrew understood. 3 days later, he advised his client that the case was indefensible. Dudley came to Katherine in the kitchen garden. Where else? "You've done this," he said, wounded, the self-pity of a man losing something he never earned. "You and that Duke. You've taken everything from me." Katherine stood, soil on her hands. She looked at him and felt nothing, really. Not triumph, not pity, just the flatness of dealing with someone who was never the point. "You had nothing before you came here, Mr. Fenton. You'll have nothing when you leave. That's not my doing. That's arithmetic." She wiped her hands on her apron. "I had nothing, too. But I built something, with it. 13 years of something. That's the difference. Not what was done to us, what we did with it." It came out harsher than she'd meant. Or maybe it didn't. Maybe she'd meant it exactly that harsh and was only now, standing in the garden with soil drying on her fingers, realizing that she was angry. That she had been angry for a very long time and had mistaken it for something more dignified. Dudley stood there for a moment. He looked like he wanted to say something else. He didn't. He picked up his coat, the borrowed one, the one that had never fit, and walked to the hired coach, and went back to Norwich, and Katherine never saw him again. She watched him go. Mrs. Kemp appeared beside her. "Good riddance." "He was not an evil man," Katherine said. "He was a weak one. My father made him the instrument. If not Dudley, it would have been some other cousin, some other man willing to inherit what he did not build. The will was not about Dudley receiving something. It was about me receiving nothing. Dudley was beside the point. Your mother would be proud of you." Katherine pressed her mother's ring against her thigh. "My mother would be furious, and she would be right." She paused, looked toward the lane where Dudley's coach had disappeared. "Half of Devizes will say I stole from him," she said. "The vicar's wife will stop calling. The Chandos family will be polite at church and cold everywhere else. Mr. Stratton will wonder whether a woman who outmaneuvered one man will outmaneuver him next." She looked at Mrs. Kemp. "I have not won, Mrs. Kemp. I have survived. And survival in this county, for a woman who has done what I have done, comes with a bill." "Let them send it," Mrs. Kemp said. "They will, but I intend to be somewhere else when it arrives." That evening James presented the full findings. The trust, the diverted funds, the probate review, her inheritance, not the full estate which would pass through the courts, but her mother's trust, the recovered funds, and a settlement that James had the authority to direct. It was enough. Not wealth, not luxury. Enough. Independence. A door. He placed the documents on the desk. Then he placed something else beside them. The original copy of the will Mr. Cartwright had read aloud on a Tuesday morning, the will that said nothing. "This is yours now," he said. "Do what you want with it." Katherine picked it up. 6 sentences. 29 years of her life. She read it one final time, carefully, slowly, with the focused attention of a woman who believed that precision mattered even when the content was poison. Then she walked to the fireplace. She held the will over the flame. The paper caught, the edges curled. The ink, her father's cramped hand, the words nothing and deliberate and judgment upon her character, darkened and crumbled. "He was wrong," she said. Not to James, not to Mrs. Kemp, who was standing in the doorway with her hand pressed to her mouth. Not to Mr. Hale behind her, his eyes bright, to the room, to the house, to the 13 years of silence and the 16 years before that, and the man who had sat in this study in his warm chair by his warm fire and decided that his daughter's invisible empire was worth exactly nothing. He was wrong. She dropped the will into the fire, watched it burn, and then, she had not expected this, she had not planned it, it was not part of the arithmetic she had run in her head about how this moment would go. Something broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a crack, somewhere behind her ribs, and her breath caught, and she put her hand on the mantelpiece to steady herself, and for about 3 seconds she was not Katherine Waverly, who managed estates and checked figures and never lost her composure. She was just a woman whose father had hated her and who had just watched the proof of it turn to ash. 3 seconds, she counted. Then she straightened, up, pressed her hands flat against her sides. "He was wrong," she said, again, steadier this time. The will had said she deserved nothing. Now the will was nothing, And she was still here, still standing, still capable of lighting a fire and watching it burn and counting the seconds until she could breathe again. James watched from across the room. He did not speak. He did not move toward her. He understood, a man who had burned a will himself, that this moment belonged to Katherine, and that his role in it was to be present and still and to not look away. So he didn't. Later. The fire burned low. Mrs. Kemp had brought tea, 2 cups, without being asked, and the room was quiet. "You said the will was wrong," Katherine said. "The first day, in the garden, before you had seen the ledger, before you knew about the trust, before anything, you looked at me and said the will was wrong. How did you know?" The spectacles came off. James was quiet for a moment. "Because I have read 1,000 wills," he said, "and the ones that use that word, nothing—" He stopped, took off his spectacles, put them back on, took them off again and held them in his hand, turning them by the temple, a man trying to find the right angle on something. When a man genuinely does not care about his daughter, he leaves her a token and moves on. £50 and a set of silverware. He doesn't think about her. He barely remembers to include her. The will reads like an afterthought because she was one. He looked at the fire. "Your father did not do that. Your father wrote the word nothing, and then he specified it, emphasized it, turned it into a speech. He wanted the solicitor to read it aloud, in a room, in front of witnesses. He wanted—" James paused. "I am saying this badly. You're not. I am. Because what I want to say sounds like I'm defending him, and I'm not." He rubbed the bridge of his nose. "A man who writes nothing that loudly is not a man, who feels nothing. He's the opposite. He's a man who is consumed, who has spent years thinking about the person he is disinheriting, about what she represents, about what her existence means for the way he understands himself." He looked at Katherine. "Your father knew what you were. He always knew. The will wasn't punishment. It was—" He searched for the word. "Confession. The will was his confession. He knew you were everything he couldn't be, everything he depended on, everything he resented, and he couldn't stand it. So he wrote nothing in his loudest voice and filed it with a solicitor and told himself that made it true." A silence. "It was not true," James said, quietly, without rhetoric. Just a man who had finished thinking and had arrived finally at the thing he meant. The will was wrong. He was wrong. And you were not nothing. You were the entire estate, every tenant fed, every creditor paid, every decision made for 13 years. You were all of it. And he knew. Katherine did not say anything for a while. She was looking at her hands, at the desk, at the place where the will had been before she burned it. The fire was low and the room was getting cold, and she should have added wood 20 minutes ago, but she had not moved, and she was not going to move now, because something was happening inside her chest that she did not have a name for, and she needed to be very still until it finished. It was not relief. It was not vindication. It was more like the feeling you get when you put down something enormously heavy that you have been carrying for so long that your body has shaped itself around the weight, and now the weight is gone, and you cannot remember what shape you were before. "Thank you," she said. "I have done nothing the numbers did not do themselves. The ledger is the proof. I merely read it. That is not what I am thanking you for." A pause. James put his spectacles on, took them off, put them on. Katherine recognized, with a jolt, that the gesture she had been reading as a thinking habit was something else entirely. He was nervous. "Miss Waverly," he said, "I will be returning to London within the week. The legal proceedings will continue through my solicitor. You will not need to, I know. The settlement should be finalized within 3 months. You will have full control of the trust and the recovered funds. Mr. Ainsworth will— I know, and He stopped, looked at the desk, looked at the fire, looked at his spectacles with an expression of total helplessness. "You will miss the tea," Katherine said. He looked up. "I will miss considerably more than the tea." Neither of them said anything else, not that night. They were not people who rushed toward things. They were people who checked the figures first. James left on a Monday morning. February had turned mild, the cold snap had broken, and the drive was soft with thaw. His horse stood saddled in the yard while he said his goodbyes. He shook Mr. Hale's hand and thanked him for 13 years of loyalty. He told Mrs. Kemp that the household accounts, the real ones, Katherine's, were the most honestly kept domestic records he had ever seen. And Mrs. Kemp said, "I should think so," and then excused herself rapidly because she was not the sort of woman who cried in front of dukes. Then he stood in the morning room with Katherine. His satchel was packed. His spectacles were clean, for once. The desk, his desk for the past 3 weeks, was bare except for a single sheet of paper. "I have left a summary of the legal proceedings," he said. "Mr. Ainsworth will write monthly. If you have questions, I will write to Mr. Ainsworth. You could also write to me." A beat. Katherine opened her mouth, and what came out was, "I'm sure you have more important correspondence." She heard herself say it and winced, internally, where he couldn't see. She had not meant to say that. She had meant to say something. She wasn't sure what. Something that acknowledged what he had done, something that was not defensive and small, and the kind of thing a person says when they have spent too many years expecting to be dismissed and have not yet learned to stop bracing for it. "I don't," James said, quietly, "have more important correspondence." Katherine looked at the bare desk, at the chair where he had sat for 14 hours a day, at the teacup, still there, unwashed, a ring of tannin at the rim. "Then I'll write," she said, "if I have objections to your methodology." "You usually do." James almost smiled. Not quite. The corner of his mouth moved, a fraction, a suggestion. He picked up his satchel. "Goodbye, Miss Waverly." "Goodbye, Your Grace." He walked to the door, stopped, turned back. "The rotation system," he said, "for tenant leases. I intend to implement it across my Hampshire estate. I may need to consult you on the transition schedule." "That would be a professional consultation," Katherine said. "I would charge a fee." "I would expect nothing less." He left. Katherine stood at the morning-room window and watched him ride down the drive. The horse turned left at the gate, south toward the London road. She watched until he disappeared behind the line of elms at the bottom of the hill. Then she sat down at his desk, picked up his teacup, held it for a moment. She set it on the window-sill. She did not wash it, not that day, not for several days, if she was honest, and she did not examine too carefully why. There was work to do. There was always work to do. 6 months later, Katherine Waverly had purchased a farmhouse. 3 miles from Waverly Hall, 8 acres of good land, a study with a south-facing window. She paid with her mother's trust. She called it Ledger House. Mrs. Kemp, who had followed her without being asked and without discussion, called it unnecessarily on the nose. Katherine kept the name. The house was not beautiful. It sat at the end of a lane that turned to mud in November and did not recover until April, and the front door stuck in damp weather, and there was a crack in the kitchen ceiling that Katherine kept meaning to have plastered and kept not having plastered, because there was always something more urgent, and the garden was mostly weeds and one stubborn rose bush that bloomed in June regardless of what anyone did or didn't do to it. On clear mornings, the light came through the study window and fell across the desk in a way that reminded her of nothing, that was connected to nothing, that was just light on wood, warm for no reason. She liked it. She sat in that light sometimes and did nothing. She was learning how to do nothing. It was harder than running an estate. She had begun consulting. Unofficially, a woman could not conduct business under her own name in 1845, not formally, but word traveled the way it always does in farming country. Miss Waverly, of Devizes, had a talent for accounts. Bring her your ledger and she would find the error. Ask her about drainage or crop rotation or tenant agreements, and the advice would be worth the asking. Farmers came first, then landowners. Then, on one memorable Tuesday, a solicitor from Bath, who had heard from a wool merchant, who had heard from a tenant, who had heard from Mr. Hale, that the woman who had actually managed the Waverly estate for 13 years was taking clients. She worked at her desk by daylight now, not candlelight. She had 12 candles in the study, and she lit them all on some evenings, not because she needed to, but because she could. James wrote. He wrote the way he did everything, with a regularity that looked systematic but which Katherine suspected was something else. Monthly at first, then fortnightly, then weekly. Letters full of figures, questions, arguments. Your tenant retention model requires adjustment for estates with mixed agriculture. The rotation intervals for arable versus pastoral do not align. I have attempted a modification. See enclosed. You will no doubt find the flaw. She found the flaw, she wrote back, and then he began visiting. Once a month at first, then every fortnight, then, by the 4th month, every Friday, arriving late morning, departing Sunday, with a leather satchel full of documents and a look on his face that Mrs. Kemp described to the scullery maid as a man who has walked into a wall and hasn't figured out which wall. The 3rd visit was the one Katherine remembered afterward, not because anything dramatic happened, because nothing dramatic happened, and that was the point. He arrived in the rain. Mrs. Kemp took his coat. He walked into the study, set his satchel on the desk, and sat down across from Katherine as though continuing a conversation that had never stopped. No pleasantries, no "How have you been?" He opened a document, pointed to a line, and said, "The Bridgewater Canal. Tolls have changed. Your freight cost projections for the wool shipments are off by 3%. They are not off by 3%. The toll change applies to westbound traffic. Our shipments go east." "Since when?" "Since I rerouted them through Trowbridge in 1841 to avoid the Kennet barge delays. The eastern route is 4 miles longer but 2 days faster. It is in the ledger, Your Grace. Page 47. He checked. Page 47. She was right. He took off his spectacles, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and said, "I am going to stop being surprised by you eventually." I doubt it. And then, neither of them had planned this. They both laughed, not loudly, not for long, but Katherine laughed, and she could not remember the last time she had laughed in this house, in any house, and the sound of it startled her, like hearing a door open in a room she'd forgotten existed. James looked at her when she laughed, just looked, and then he put his spectacles back on and returned to the document and said nothing about it, and Katherine was grateful, because if he had said anything, she would have had to stop, and she was not ready to stop. Not yet. They talked, argued about interest rates, debated drainage. He showed her his estate accounts, and she found 3 inefficiencies in the first hour, which he corrected immediately, without defensiveness, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who values accuracy over pride. He left notes in the margins of her documents. In the ledger she kept on the desk. small, precise observations in his narrow handwriting. Your Stratton projection is conservative by 12%. Have you accounted for the new drainage? The Bath solicitor overcharged you by 2 guineas on the conveyancing. I have written to him. There is a new publication on crop rotation from the Royal Agricultural Society. I have ordered you a copy, and one for myself, because I expect you will want to argue about it, and I intend to be prepared, Katherine replied in kind. She corrected his calculations when they were wrong, which was rarely. She annotated his reports with observations he had missed, which was slightly less rarely. She left a note on his desk during one visit. Your Hampshire wheat yield estimate is optimistic. Check the rainfall data for March. You will find I am right. He checked. She was right. He poured her tea before his own. Every visit, without asking, without comment, as though her cup mattering more than his was simply the order of the universe, too obvious to mention. No one had poured her tea since her mother died. The proposal, when it came, arrived not as a declaration, but as a document. James appeared at Ledger House on a Friday in August with his satchel and an expression that Mrs. Kemp later described as a man approaching a fortification he is not certain he can take. He sat at the desk across from Katherine, his desk by now, by unspoken agreement, and produced a document from the satchel. A marriage settlement, 14 pages, 3 solicitors. It specified in exhaustive detail that Katherine would retain full ownership of her property, her income, her consultancy, and her ledger. Independent bank account. No decisions regarding her assets without her written consent. An equal partner in every respect the law allowed. I had this written so that you would never have to trust me, he said. Every clause is verifiable. Every provision is enforceable to the extent that the law currently allows. He paused. He had the expression of a man who has just been honest when he could have been reassuring, and who chose honest anyway. I need to tell you something about this document. Under coverture, under the law as it stands today, a married woman's property becomes her husband's. A settlement like this can protect some assets, but enforcement depends on the courts, and the courts do not always enforce what they should. This document is the strongest protection my solicitors could build. But it is not perfect. The law is not on our side. He looked at her. I wrote it anyway, because the law should be, and because I intend to honor every clause in this settlement whether the courts enforce them or not. If that is not sufficient, it is sufficient, Katherine said, because you are the first man who has told me the truth about the limits of what he is offering, rather than pretending the limits do not exist. Katherine took the document. She read it, all 14 pages, slowly, thoroughly, the way she read everything, with the focused attention of a woman who had learned, at great cost, that details matter more than gestures. On page 9, she stopped. You have transposed a figure. The annual allocation in Clause 7 does not match the summary on page 12. The discrepancy is £4. James looked at her. He was doing that thing with his face again, the thing she had noticed over 6 months, of visits, the thing he probably didn't know he did, where his expression would start as one thing and end as something else entirely, like watching weather change across a valley. He had started with amusement. He ended somewhere closer to terrified. I know, he said. I left it in on purpose. You left an error in a legal document on purpose. I wanted to see if you would find it. That is a terrible basis for a marriage proposal. It is the most honest one I could think of. I do not want a wife who trusts me, Miss Waverly. I want a wife who checks my arithmetic. Katherine looked at him. She thought about the ledger, about 13 years, about the candle and the floorboard and the cold room, about her mother saying, "Be careful with your father," and about Mrs. Kemp in the kitchen with her shaking hands, about the will that said nothing and the fire that ate it, and about this man, this strange, specific, ink-stained man who had ridden 3 days for someone he'd never met, who checked his own arithmetic and didn't flinch when she corrected it, who had burned nothing himself but had put the will in her hand and stepped back and let her do it. He hadn't told her she was remarkable. Remarkable was what you said about a sunset or a performance. He had told her she was right, over and over, in the margins of documents, in arguments about wool prices, in that first moment in the garden when he looked at her ledger and said the will was wrong. He had never once suggested she needed saving. He had suggested she needed a witness. And then he had done the work of witnessing. She was not sure she loved him. She was not sure what that word meant for her after 29 years in a house that had taught her that love was a thing other people had, and she managed the accounts for. But she was sure of this. She did not want him to leave. And she wanted to check his arithmetic for a very long time. And that might not be love in the way the novels described it, but it was something, and it was hers, and it was enough. "Yes," she said. The wedding was small. The parish church in Devizes, a Tuesday in October. Mrs. Kemp and Mr. Hale as witnesses. Mr. Gould, the wool merchant, who had driven 4 hours from Bristol because, he said, "Miss Waverly saved my business £300 in a single letter, and if she is getting married, I intend to be there to see the poor man's face." James's vows were not traditional. He had written them in advance. Katherine found the drafts later, 3 versions, each one crossed out and restarted, the handwriting getting less steady with each attempt. "I vow to check your arithmetic and accept correction when mine is wrong. I vow to never lock a study door." He paused, looked at the ceiling of the church. Mrs. Kemp, who was watching closely, saw him swallow. "I vow to keep 12 candles in every room where you work, and to light them whether or not you need them because you spent—" He stopped. His voice had done something he had not given it permission to do. The vicar waited. Katherine waited. The entire church waited. James took a breath. "Because you spent too many years in the dark." Steadier now. "I vow to read every ledger you produce, and to argue with you when I disagree, which will be rarely, and to concede when you are right, which will be almost always. And I vow that your name will appear on every document, every account, every piece of work that is yours. No more proxies, no more hiding." He looked at her. "Your name, Katherine, always." Katherine's vows were shorter. She had never been a woman who used more words than necessary. She had planned 3 lines. She delivered 2.5 because her voice held for the first 2 and then did something unexpected on the 3rd. "I vow to correct your arithmetic for the rest of your life, to pour my own tea, and to never—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, breathed. "To never be invisible again." She said the last 4 words, looking directly at him, and her voice was not steady, and she did not care. Mr. Gould wept. Mrs. Kemp wept louder. Mr. Hale, who had kept Katherine's secret for 13 years, and who had finally, at 61, seen her acknowledged for what she was, stood very straight and blinked very rapidly and pressed a handkerchief to his face in a way that was absolutely not weeping, because stewards did not weep. The handkerchief disagreed. That evening at Ledger House they sat in the study. 2 desks, 2 chairs, 2 cups of tea, a fire in the grate that Katherine had lit herself. On the mantelpiece, 3 objects. Katherine's hidden ledger. 13 years of invisible work, retired from service. Her mother's ring, worn on her right hand since she was 11, today joined by a wedding band on her left, and a small brass frame holding a piece of paper. the solicitor's receipt from Devizes. 3 shillings, the one that told her the law could not help her. She kept it as a reminder, not of defeat, of the distance between where the law had placed her and where she had arrived. James was reading. Katherine was writing. Not accounts, not ledgers, but a letter. To the Agricultural Review, her first publication under her own name. An essay on tenant lease structures and their effect on productivity, built on 13 years of data that she no longer had to hide. 37 years later, in 1882, Parliament would finally pass the Married Women's Property Act, the real one, the one with teeth, giving women like Katherine the legal right to own what they earned, to keep what was theirs, to exist in the eyes of the law as people rather than appendages. Katherine was 66 by then. She had been owning what she earned since she was 12. The law, as it always does, arrived late and took credit for what women had already built without its permission. "Katherine," James said without looking up from his book. "Yes?" "Your Hampshire barley projection has an error." She set down her pen. "It does not. Page 3, the rainfall coefficient." She checked again. "The rainfall coefficient is correct. Then explain the discrepancy with the March data." "There is no discrepancy. You are reading the county average. I am using the local station. The local station is more accurate. Source citation, page 4. James checked, looked at the citation, looked at his own figures, removed his spectacles, put them back on. "You are right," he said. "I am aware." A pause. Then, from across the room, in a voice that was not smooth and was not steady, and came out as though James had been holding it behind his teeth for months, and it had simply escaped. "I love you." And then, immediately, as if he had not meant to say it yet, "I was going to. There was a better time. I was going to say it after." He stopped, took off his spectacles, put them on. "That was not how I planned to say that." "How did you plan to say it?" "With more context, and possibly a preamble, and not while you were in the middle of proving me wrong about barley." Katherine did not look up from her letter, but the corner of her mouth moved, not a smile exactly, something smaller and truer, the kind of expression that only forms on the face of a person who has just heard exactly the right thing said in exactly the wrong way. "I know," she said. "Your arithmetic told me months ago." The fire burned. The tea went cold. And in a study lit by 12 candles, a woman who had been left nothing wrote her name on a document for the first time. Across the room, the man who loved her read his book and did not bother pretending he wasn't smiling. Outside it rained, October rain, steady and patient, falling on Wiltshire the way it had fallen for centuries, on the houses and the fields and the lives of people who were, slowly, unevenly, in fits and starts and setbacks, figuring out that silence was not the same as absence, and that the women they had overlooked had been holding everything together the entire time. And somewhere in the ashes of a fireplace at Waverly Hall, the remains of a will that said nothing settled into dust, and the word lost its power and was gone. And that, my friends, is the story of the woman who was left nothing, and the Duke who said the will was wrong, and the ledger that proved it. Thank you for being here tonight. Every listen, every comment, every subscription builds this community, and this community is built on the belief that your work matters, that your mind matters, that the things you build in silence, without credit, without recognition, those things are real. They exist. They count. And the people who told you otherwise were wrong. If this story stayed with you, I want to hear about it. Tell me which part. Was it the will? The garden scene? Was it the 13 years of candles and hidden floorboards, and a woman who, Ran an estate nobody thanked her for? The kitchen, with Mrs. Kemp? The fire? Or was it page 9 of a marriage settlement, and a man who left an error in on purpose? I don't know which moment it was for you, but I know there was one. Drop it below. I read every comment, every one, and if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. The next story is coming. It's going to hurt in the best way. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and if someone has decided what you're worth before you had a chance to show them what you built, remember this: their words are paper. Paper burns. What you built doesn't. Good night. I'll see you in the next one.